Well, I haven't always been involved in academia. I suppose I'm reminded of that little sort of parable that you're destined to become the thing that you absolutely detest. And I was sort of spat out into the world of the late 80s, really. And anybody from that period, I mean, you've got to put yourself into the shoes of a sort of a young child going to the library and being handed a copy of Protect and Survive, facing the imminence of sort of a nuclear apocalypse on the horizon. It was a funny time, and I was very much of the opinion that what I needed post-school was not an academic career, but I needed a good set of tools so I could build myself a sort of nuclear bunker to survive the impending horror. Of course, life hasn't quite turned out like that. I'm not an end timer, I should say, but I was very much sort of practically based. I wanted to do stuff, I like doing things with my hands. And in fact, what did I do? Gosh, well, I left school. The first thing I did was I went to college, and I lasted about 3 months at college. It was a sociology lecture that we did. And what happened was we were sitting in a class talking about kibbutzes. And I was absolutely convinced that if we were really to learn about kibbutzes, that I was not going to get that done by sitting in a classroom. And I actually gave up college. I gave up, so I left without any A levels, any things like that. I gave up college, and I ended up living on a kibbutz in Israel. And actually, you know, to sort of be transposed from that sort of late 80s period suddenly out in the Middle East, it was an absolutely glorious, eye-opening experience. And I'm not sure I ever really sort of came back off that journey. I probably I was about a year out in Israel, but really in the sort of 10 years before I would go back to education, I really spent most of my life just sort of bumming around Europe. I had a guitar on my back, I did a lot of busking, and really sort of made my way like that. So the academic career was actually, you know, one of the furthest things from my mind. I liked manual work, and I was convinced that in the world that was to come, it was those kinds of skills that would actually sort of, you know, would be the important ones that would help you get through. So no, I haven't been involved in academia, and I pursued a variety of sort of generally sort of manual laboured jobs, everything from gardening, construction, playing music, etc., etc., but not academia. But as I said, I was destined to become the thing that I absolutely thought was rubbish and useless. So I suppose the question is, what drew me into the field of academic theology? You know, I never didn't like reading books. I never didn't read. And in fact, I never didn't write. I was a voracious writer of songs and poetry and things like that. And, you know, even in the carpentry I still think that it involved various forms of sort of composition, for example, and conceptual awareness that I'd later be able to transpose into my academic field. But what really drew me into the field of theology was an increasing sense that despite all the places I got to visit around the world, they impressed upon me the need to understand my own culture in a lot more depth. I'd hitched from Athens, you know, back to the white cliffs of Dover. I knew what it was to make that physical journey. But what about the intellectual journey? How did we get from ancient Greek thought to where we are now, this crazy sort of postmodern world that we live in? And as I said, I'd always enjoyed reading, but what I increasingly began to recognise was that if I was to answer those questions, if I was to make that intellectual journey from ancient Greece to the postmodern, then I needed some form of systematic learning. I needed a framework. I actually needed the kinds of things that a university provides. A systematic framework, lecturers to help you progress and understand the critical aspects of how we get to where we are intellectually. So in that sense, you know, I think that was really what sort of, you know, ultimately drew me back into education. And theology in particular. Well, why theology? Well, I know this may sound a little bit crazy, but you know, sometimes you think this idea is so mad it'll probably work. I always worked on the assumption that if you started from the presupposition of God, it's an enormous creative license to do and say an awful lot more than you could perhaps get away with within, say, the social sciences, or even in the sort of, you know, the somewhat materialistic environment of philosophy departments in this country. So there was a sense of the absolute, whether you believe in God or not, God's the ultimate literary creation. Who wouldn't want to study it? But I also think that one of the things that intrigues me about theology is that you could probably study philosophy and never have to do the question of God. You could probably do psychology and never do God. You could even do sociology and not have to study the question of God. It'd be tricky. But you can't do theology without having to pass through Nietzsche, without having to pass through Karl Marx, without having to pass through Freud. And in that sense, theology struck me very much as the ultimate sort of combined honours. If you do theology, you have to, by necessity, undertake all those other disciplines, but you can do the other disciplines without doing theology. So in that sense, I suppose I was already making myself an argument that theology was one of the, the principal areas of, the key area of intellectual inquiry. But the other thing, going back to that sort of apocalyptic 80s scene, one of the people that I greatly credit with inspiring me to do theology was none other than Mrs. Thatcher. And it's not that Mrs. Thatcher was, the Methodist, her famous quoting of, St. Francis in her inauguration. No. You couldn't grow up in the 1980s with Mrs. Thatcher and not think to yourself, in that time when there was this hard economic turn towards really entrenched capitalism, you couldn't live in that era and think to yourself, there's got to be more to life than just this. So in many respects, theology really sort of opened out and provided the forum to start to answer the kinds of questions that were being thrown up in the face of a very bleak environment. So now that I do have an academic career in theology, what kind of theology do I find most fascinating? I suppose what interests me is the integrity of the theological voice. I've never been one for great systematics in the first place. I'm too much of an unsystematic thinker to be able to put that systematics together. I've also never been a great I'm not a sort of patristic scholar. My languages, especially my early languages, are not great. But what I do believe in, very fundamentally, and I suppose this makes me very modern, is the integrity of people's voices to articulate theology. And I was very struck quite early on how a lot of almost what you might consider secular philosophers were really making the case and giving an articulate theological voice in ways that I was not necessarily finding within your standard theology. Why can't we do theology through the likes of the musician John Cage, for example? These days I teach a lot of Zizek, and of course he's a secular atheist Marxist. But why is he selling more theological books than theologians? What is it about that voice? So when you ask the area of which theology I find most fascinating, it's often the theology that we find in those strange places, and not necessarily within the standard canon of thought, one might say in the vernacular tradition, in the tradition of the people. And I suppose the other area I particularly like, and this is related, is in the philosophical world. It's very easy to disparage, as I've already mentioned Freud, it's very easy to disparage Freud. But I've always thought that, if religion, as Freud said, is a social form of neurosis, then can't you turn that round? Isn't neurosis a privatized form of religion? And, so I've always considered that actually buried deep within these secular philosophies are actually in their own way some quite implicit theological positions, which I'm very keen on teasing out. So I like to do a sort of left-handed theology, often coming at it from the philosophical world, but trying to explore the way that however much we try to, sort of make theology disappear from the world, actually we're going to find it cropping up in all sorts of places. That's the theology I find fascinating.